So today's webinar is on advancing your research, journal submission basics. I'm Hillary Miller.
I'm Julie Orange.
Okay, so we kind of wanted to go over what we're not doing first in this specific webinar because you may have seen or may not yet have seen that we have done a few webinars on similar topics in this Advance Your Research series before. So previously we talked about how to pick a journal, how to match the journal to the specific article that you're looking to publish. We've talked some about authorship criteria, and we've also talked about avoiding publishing scams or scam journals. So when you go to the Advance Your Research guide on the library website, you can see a publishing box that's going to have recordings of previous webinars on these topics. And if you're looking for information on how to convert a dissertation chapter or thesis into an article, this is something that we advise you to see an advisor about, or the Writing Center as a resource, because the libraries don't do as much in the area of writing an article for publication. What we are covering today is compliance with journal requirements, so how to make sure that you understand all of the sometimes very specific requirements that journals have for submission and publication. We're going to walk through a journal submission system so you can see what this looks like if you've never seen it before, and along the way point out what kind of issues can crop up during the submission process. We're going to go through the peer review process and the potential snags you might see there as well. And then we'll finish up by talking about what happens after an article has been accepted for publication. So the first step, as we saw, was making sure that you understand and that you're able to comply with all of the journal's requirements for publication. The idea here is know exactly what you're getting into up front, because there would be probably few things worse than submitting to a journal, going through a really long process of peer review and being accepted, and then realizing that there may be some kind of requirement that you are not able to comply with for publication. So the first one I want to talk about is copyright permissions. This is going to apply if you are using any third-party materials, which is the term usually used in journal policies. Basically what that means, are you using anyone else's stuff? Publishers generally want authors to get explicit written permission to use other people's works rather than relying on copyright exceptions, such as fair use, for example, if you're familiar with this, that sometimes say you don't need to get permission, but generally speaking, publishers want to see written permission for everything that is going to be a part of your article. The exception here is that brief quotations of text from other articles or other sources are usually excluded for this. But if you're using images, figures, tables, or very large quotations of text from other articles, it's likely going to require permission to be a part of your new article. So here is one example of a copyright permissions policy. This is from a journal that's published by SAGE. The journal is actually called Research Ethics. And I'm going to use this journal and SAGE in a couple of examples to provide you with some, sort of on-the-ground specific examples of what you might see in these policies. You can see here it's pretty basic. Ensure that you've gotten the necessary permissions to reproduce these. And it also illustrates what I think is a pretty important concept that you should be aware of in the publishing process. So like a lot of other journals, this individual journal called Research Ethics is published by a very large publisher. SAGE actually publishes over 1,000 individual journals. And so when you're reviewing these manuscript submission guidelines, you're going to see a mix of language that may be specific to the journal, and a lot of places where you're told to see here for more information that's going to direct you to policy that applies at the publisher level to all journals that they publish. So you might have to visit multiple pages bouncing back between the journal and the publisher websites in order to answer any questions you might have about the submission or publishing process. And if you ever have any trouble finding answers in the mix of all of this policy, you can always contact the libraries for help. So this is an example of a very brief permissions policy and points you to the SAGE policy, which I didn't include here. It's far too long to copy or even screenshot in for a webinar. It's a little confusing in my opinion, but it says, as I mentioned before, you don't necessarily need permission if your use falls under the concept of fair use, which is a copyright law exception. But there are no concrete rules about what is or isn't fair use, and at the same time SAGE says if you have any doubt about whether your use is fair use or not, you should go ahead and get permission. I think this can look like a gray area, but it kind of underscores that concept I shared earlier, which is that publishers generally want to see explicit written permission when you are using other people's works. So some of the key takeaways for the permissions process overall. Number one, I don't think I can emphasize this enough. I think it's really important to go through the motions of getting this written permission for third-party materials before you submit the article. So you don't necessarily need to go all the way through, right? Get the written form. Sometimes there may be fees involved. You don't need to necessarily pay those up front. But what this will help you do is identify any possible issues that might come up in the publishing process. So for example, a lot of the permissions might be free of cost. Some might be more expensive than you are able to cover. Some of the things you want to use might not have a clear way to get that permission, or it might not always be obvious who you should be asking for permission. And so it's really important to figure this out up front, because if you're doing this at the end of the publishing process, it can be really difficult at that point to leave out the materials that you want to use. You might have to find alternatives if you can't get the permission you need. So it's always best to have this out of the way as soon as possible. You can also always contact the publisher, the journal editor, or the libraries for help with this process. Like I said, whether that's just navigating permissions or figuring out who the copyright owner even is in some cases. So here is an example of a journal article. Let's say you want to use a table from this journal article. There is something I wanted to see if anyone notices about this journal article right off the bat that tells you something actually pretty exciting about how you might or might not get permission to use this article in your own research. Does anyone see anything on the screen here?
Chat is open.
Chat is open if you want to shout out. Okay, so it's a little bit small, but if you can see this little logo here, it says CC and it's got some other symbols on it. This is something called Creative Commons. That means that this article is an open access article. It's been published under an open license, and what that means is that the permission for you to use this article, including figures or quotations or images from it, is already given to you. You don't need to go ask for permission after the fact. You already have these permissions. They're built into the publication process. Here is another example from a SAGE journal. This is Communication in the Public. So this one, you can see there is no open access symbol here. This is a traditional subscription access article. So there's also another tiny button here on the page called Request Permissions. You'll see some variation of this on the landing page for most articles. So that's where you go to get the permissions you need to reuse a part of this article. This on the screen here is an example of a platform called RightsLink, or from the Copyright Clearance Center. This is really, really common for most journal publishers, especially large journal publishers, to use this platform to give you an automatic process to request and get permission to reuse articles or parts of articles. And you can see here, we won't walk through it all. There are a lot of different fields you have to fill out here, but what you're hoping for and looking for is that quick price there at the bottom right. In many cases, if you are using, for example, one figure from an article to publish in another article, you'll fill this out and that quick price in a lot of cases will be zero, although it can be a couple $100s in other cases. We won't go through, again, all of this, but this is another case where if you have trouble filling out a form like this, or if it's asking for money that you might not be able to pay, get in touch with the libraries for help, and we may be able to help you navigate this process. So the next journal requirement that I want to talk about is sharing research data or data sharing policy from the journal. This applies to data underlying the findings presented in the article. So it might not be every bit of data you've collected throughout your entire research project, but it will be the data, for example, that underlies figures you use or tables or the specific findings within the scope of the article. And it's not something that's required by all journals, although it is becoming more common. And if it is required, the data may or may not be a part of the peer review process that your article goes through. Yes. So I'm going to use SAGE as another example here, just to point you quickly to the way that they kind of break down their data sharing policies in their journals. They say that their journals will follow one of these options. So option one, which is the vast majority of their journals right now, they really just encourage authors to share data somewhere publicly online, cite the data set within the article, and link to it. Option two is a requirement to do all of these things with the data. And option three, which is the least common for now, but is sort of the highest level of work required on your part, is called verification. So not only do you share, cite, and link to the data, but the data is actually going to be a part of the peer review process. The peer reviewers are going to be asked to consider that data as a part of their review. So why should you care about all of this? One reason is that if you are making any decisions about sharing data similar to publishing an article, your research collaborators absolutely need to be involved in the decision making. There may be questions about who owns the data. For example, if you are working with an advisor on research, if your research is conducted in some kind of lab setting. So everyone needs to be involved in this decision making. And this decision making actually needs to happen a lot sooner in the process than at the point where you're submitting an article. If you submitted an IRB and got approval from the IRB for your research, they will have asked about your plans for data sharing. You may not have intended to do that at the time. So if this is something you later want to do, you may need to go back to the IRB to seek approval, or at least check and see if that was part of a part of the plan you submitted. And the other important question is your data ready to be shared? Preparing data to be reviewed by someone else who was not a part of your research process is quite a bit more work usually than just sharing data internally with your research team or an advisor. So the last one I'm going to talk about before I pass things over to Julie is, are you publishing an article that's based on your thesis or dissertation research? And if so, you need to consider whether or not this counts as what's called prior publication, sometimes called previous publication, duplicate publication, redundant publication, a lot of different names you'll see in journal policies for this. And these terms all describe a situation where some part of your article has already been published or shared in a public setting or shared online in some way. So there are three important questions that you need to answer before you submit an article to a journal if this is the case. First is, does the journal have a policy on prior publication? The answer is almost certainly yes, and you're going to find this in the author guidelines or the manuscript submission guidelines. But the policy might not be very detailed. So if it doesn't answer questions you have, if it doesn't specifically, for example, mention the situation where the article may be based on thesis or dissertation or other graduate research, you should definitely contact the editor before you submit. The next one is, how does the journal define prior publication? Again, do they have these exceptions for articles based on a thesis or dissertation? This definition really does vary from publication to publication. You're probably familiar with the sort of standard definition, which is that the article shouldn't have been published in another peer-reviewed journal, shouldn't be under review in another peer-reviewed journal, for example. But in a lot of cases, there are exceptions for a thesis or dissertation, for research that was presented at a conference, or even working versions of the article that you shared on preprint platforms. And lastly, very importantly, what requirements do you need to follow to indicate that your article was published or shared online in some way? So again, we're going to turn to an example from the journal Research Ethics by Sage. This one here may not seem very promising at first. This is from the journal page. So if the material has been previously published, it's generally not acceptable for publication in a Sage journal. However, there are circumstances where it may be considered. So if you go to the actual Right Sage Author Gateway, it takes you to a much more expanded policy. And luckily, this one does specifically say dissertations and theses, including ones that are posted publicly online in an institution's archives or publishing platform, which is the way it happens at VCU, can be considered. The hyperlink, one second, also it gives you information about what you need to do in order to make sure that you're completely in compliance with this. First is that you disclose this when you submit. So when you submit the manuscript to the journal, you need to let the editor know up front. It's also important to ensure that you provide proper attribution to the publication. So that may be a thesis or dissertation or wherever else it's been shared. And that you quote. Even if you're quoting yourself, you are identifying that as quote so that anyone who's reading the article can reference the original place where this work was shared. And this kind of policy is not unique to Sage. Sage, like a lot of other publishers, follows a set of best practices based on this Committee on Publication Ethics, which basically underscores the same things we just saw there. Always let the editor know upon submission where else your work has been published, and include a citation or acknowledgement to the thesis or dissertation. So the reason I bring this up is because of some real world examples I have seen or heard of in this space. A couple of ways that this concept of prior publication could play out in the publishing process are if the plagiarism software your article goes through actually flags your article because it finds your thesis or your dissertation somewhere online, and it may have a similar title or some similar portions of text to it. It's also possible that a peer reviewer finds your thesis or dissertation online as well and might raise this as a question of prior publication in their comments. So what do you do if you find yourself in either of these cases? The best way to not have this be, too stressful or too much of an issue is to know the policy before you submit and comply with any requirements. The easiest way to answer any questions, for example, a peer reviewer might raise, is to be able to point directly to the journal policy itself and state that you are fully in compliance. Okay, we're going to pause really quickly. I'm going to turn things over to Julie.
During the pause, please, if you have questions about what Hillary talked about, put them in the chat so that we can address them now rather than waiting all the way for the end to address questions, because she's right here. You can pop back in over if anything comes up. Okay. I think I've waited long enough, so we'll move on to the next slide, which is to talk about, now that you've looked at all of these policies and figured out that you're able to comply with them for the journal that you want to publish with, it seems like the next step is pretty straightforward. You're just going into a website that the publisher has provided and filling out a whole bunch of paperwork. And most of the paperwork seems like it's just asking you to repeat some of the same things that you already have put in the article, the title, the abstract, the names of your co-authors, maybe some author affiliation information. Boring form filling to do. But in each step of filling out what seems like a fairly basic, straightforward form, there are some issues that can come up with authorship and with making sure that the information is accurate that you may not have thought of before you got to this point. So even at the first page, in this case, I've chosen a journal from Emerald and using the ScholarOne manuscript system, which is one of a few of the products that are used by multiple publishers for their submission systems. And even on this login page, there's already an opportunity for something different. So you see that you could create a username and ID, and then below it is login with ORCID ID. And this is not quite the same as logging in with your Facebook ID. ORCID is actually a system of assigning identification numbers and putting an identification number to be associated with a particular person. This can be useful for people who have undergone name changes, that they're able to have publications follow the different names that they prefer to have used for them without having that publication record becoming spotty, that someone who is trying to look at the history of that person's work having to know about all of those name changes in order to track someone down. And there are computer systems that sometimes make some effort to do this, but really because there are so many people who have exactly the same name, who may even work in similar fields at the same institution, you can run into trouble if there's not a way to uniquely identify yourself as yourself. So ORCID is a system that tries to alleviate this problem by allowing you to have an individualized identification number that is saying, yes, I am me, even if I went by this other name 10 years ago, and 10 years from now, I might go by a different name. And I am me, I'm not this other person who has the exact same name as me. So this allows computer systems to aggregate data better, which sometimes becomes important because research funders and universities and other organizations are starting to use these data aggregation services to headhunt people and find who is the most prominent researcher in this area. And if you're trying to build a strong profile for yourself, you want to have all of that data aggregated to show your work over time and your accomplishments. So I would say that for most people, ORCID is a good idea to be creating for yourself even early on in your career, because then that makes it simpler for you to just have things automatically associated with you. Now, that also may be something that will come up with your co-authors, that they will have an ORCID ID. So it's something, if their opportunity exists to be entering that information, you would have to check with your co-authors and make sure you actually have that information and are entering it correctly for what they want to be including in there. Because on occasion, there are people who even have reasons that they have created two separate IDs for either different research lines or different times in their careers, and they actually want to be sort of treated as two separate people. And so looking at an old paper to check on their ORCID ID might actually not be what they would want to have done. So it's better to ask your co-authors and make sure that you have the correct information for them. Now, when you get a little bit further into this particular submission system, it asks for a structured abstract. And hopefully you'll have already realized this when you were looking at the instructions for authors and know that you have to have this structured abstract and know exactly what the word limits are for each of the portions of the structured abstract. But I personally have had the experience of discovering when I got to this point that they were much more specific about what they wanted for the length of each of the portions of the structured abstract than I had been, which meant that I had to go back and revise the abstract when I got to this point. And so this is just a reminder to first read the instructions carefully beforehand, but then also to be prepared to spend a little bit more time and even possibly have to revise your article as you're doing something that just seems like it's a little bit of paperwork. Similarly, you want to be paying attention to any requirements they have about the figures and the document types that you're uploading. Occasionally you run into journals that will have unusual policies saying things like your images must be in TIFF format. And oftentimes you would not have thought of that until you got to this point of, oh, I have JPEGs or I have PNGs and not TIFFs. And then you have to go through a little bit more revision of figuring out, okay, how can I get to an image editor that will allow me to save in that format? Another fairly straightforward looking thing here is where it asks you for keywords. In some cases, the journal may have specified keywords that they use it as a classification system, or they use it as a specific set of subject headings in their system, and you'll have to look up the keywords in a list that they provide. If you have the opportunity to just be including your own keywords in the form, you want to be thinking about what the keywords are going to be used for. And the keywords are going to be what will help someone locate your article if they are looking in a library database, because the library database is pulling information from your title, from your abstract, and from the keywords. So you may want to think about what additional words are not included in your abstract that someone might care about when they're looking for this article. So for example, if you're using a particular qualitative method, you might have included the specific name of that method in your abstract, but you might then want to say qualitative in your keywords so that someone who's looking for qualitative research would be able to locate your article because you had that word included in your keywords. So in addition to just trying to pick the most important words for your keywords, also think about what's missing in your abstract that someone's going to care about and that you want to highlight by having these additional terms that you're able to enter in this form. And then I mentioned already about including the ORCID with the author's information for not just you, but your co-authors. But you also want to check with your co-authors for other information. Does your co-author go by Will or Bill or William as a published author? And you may know that already from seeing all of their prior publications, but you may not know that. You may be calling your co-author one thing in the lab when they want to be called something else as their sort of official published title. So it's worth the time, even though it feels a little bit silly, of checking with your co-authors and saying, what's your name? So that you can be sure that the name that they're publishing under is the name that they want to be publishing under. Similarly with institutions, sometimes faculty in particular will have dual appointments in different departments or at multiple institutions, and that because of the way their promotion tenure system works at the particular institutions they're affiliated with, they want to have the institutions listed in a particular way or comprehensively, and you may not know that without asking your co-authors, okay, do you just need this one department at this one institution, or is there additional or other information that needs to be included in here as you're filling out, again, what seems like a basic form of, yeah, you know your co-authors, you know where they work. Sometimes it actually is more complicated than what you're encountering in your day-to-day interactions with the people you're working with. Then the slide will advance. Sorry for this. So then we get to the order of the author names. This is something that we talked about in a previous Advance Your Research, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, other than to say you should go and look at those previous videos where it discusses how the author order has meaning. But unfortunately, depending on the discipline you're in, that may be variable. So in some fields, it's just traditional that everyone gets their name listed alphabetically. And it doesn't matter how big the contribution was. And in other fields, the person who did most of the work is listed first, and the person who provided the funding and resources is listed last. And who, you know, that person usually is also supervising the work of the person who is sort of in the day-to-day lab operation of conducting an experiment. hopefully you'll be learning this as part of your graduate studies as you're working with faculty. And if not, this is the kind of thing that you might want to be asking about if you're planning on publishing regularly. Okay, what are the customs here? And then once you know the customs, there's still the issue of working with your co-authors so that the order that is listed there reflects the meaning that is implied by that order in your particular discipline. And we talked about this more in the previous AYR of the sort of the social difficulties that you might encounter of going through that negotiation. So then in addition to that, there is this field where you check off who is the corresponding author. By default, it usually assigns the corresponding author to be whoever is submitting the article, but you may not want that to be the case because the corresponding author is marked like with a little asterisk on the article saying this is the person to contact if they have questions about the content of the article. And the first instinct here would be to have the person who is most knowledgeable about the article be the person who's going to be answering those questions. But then it gets a little bit more complicated, especially for you if you're a graduate student, that you may be in a transition phase where you're going from graduate school to a postdoc to a first permanent position or something along those lines where your email is going to be changing several times over the next few years, and that someone contacting you 5 years from now may or may not be able to reach you at the email that is listed on that particular article. So oftentimes the corresponding author is selected as the person who's going to be most reachable in 5 or 10 years when someone might be contacting, not just the person who is most knowledgeable, with the idea that if the question is something that that person can't answer because they weren't directly involved in what that question is about, that they will know where the person who can answer it is and be able to forward it to the appropriate person. In some cases, some of the issues involved with author order are handled more directly than just having the authors listed in a particular order. They're handled by explicitly crediting people for the types of contributions that they made. So NISO, a standards making body, has actually created a list of standardized roles that can be used to sort of assign people to have done different things to contribute to the article. And these roles can be used both in journals that ask for you to explicitly state who contributed what to it, but it also can be used in the acknowledgements so that people who you're acknowledging who have contributed to the article but not sufficiently to be credited as an author have their specific contributions described in a way that then, again, thinking about computer systems that are going around aggregating information about authors and other people who are involved in scholarship, are going to be able to pull and gather that information and credit that person for what they did as a contribution. So that is a fairly complicated version of submitting to a journal where you have this form you have to fill out and a lot of the information is just duplicated from what you've already put in your title and abstract. And there are some journals, like some of the journals that are published by Wiley, where you don't have to do any of that. It takes the document that you submit and pulls the author's names off of it and pulls the abstract out and takes care of all of that for you. And then also, oftentimes, these journals also will say, use whatever citation format you want. You can take care of formatting them later to be in compliance with the requirements for this particular journal. It's like, this is so much easier. Isn't this great? And so the Wiley site was very much praising itself for how much easy they made the process for authors. And that's true. But as you sort of saw when I was going through that form, you have to have the information correct. And what correct is has a lot to do with what the people who you're working with want. How do your co-authors want to be addressed? Are you using the right number of words in different parts of the abstract? Those things, even if a computer can suck all of that information off of your cover sheet, doesn't mean that you'll have had the correct information there. So you want to make sure like you have the ORCID ID for the people who you're working with and for yourself. You want to make sure that all of the emails are correct and all of the institutional affiliations are covered here. And the computer isn't going to know that without you having done the legwork to make sure that you've done it beforehand. Now, in addition to this paperwork, there's some more complicated pieces to an article submission. So one thing that journals often ask for is a cover letter. And this is just a letter to the editor of the journal saying, hi, this is what this article is about. This is why I think you would be interested in it for this journal in particular. So it's not just copying your abstract over, but it's more of a personal appeal to the particular editor of why is this a good idea to publish in this journal. There are a lot of websites from editors saying why, what they're looking for and that they kind of are looking to be pitched to, but at the same time, you want to be professional in this messaging. My personal preference for how I write this cover letter is very much based on the process I used for selecting a journal. So if you go back to the previous AYR and watch the video, you'll know that I just select journals largely based on finding which journals have published something similar previously. So then it's easy for me to write this cover letter because I can say, this is like these other articles you published because blah, blah, blah. This is different and unique and novel because of blah, blah, blah. And sort of saying, yes, this is appropriate for your journal because it's like these other articles you publish. And here's why you still want to publish this thing that is something new and different from what you've published already. So this gives me two benefits. One is I've sort of covered all those bases without having to think very hard because I did all that work when I was picking out the journal. But the other thing is in that process, I've in kind of a sneaky way suggested some people who are going to have the expertise to be good reviewers for my article because I've mentioned specifically these other works, and then the journal editor can possibly say, oh, I know who wrote that other article. Maybe they would be a good reviewer, because one of the later steps for the editor is to find someone who's actually going to be qualified to review your article. And you usually have at least better comments from the reviewers if they understand your work and know where it's coming from than if it's someone who's broadly in a similar field to you, but may not be specifically working on the exact kind of project that you're working on. So then once you've submitted it, you should get sort of an automated message saying it's been received. If you aren't seeing that automated message, check your spam folder because you want to be basically marking all of these automated messages as not spam so that they actually land in your inbox. But because it's a computer-generated message, it has some similarities to messages that are spam. So it's worth making a little bit of an effort to verify, yes, these messages are coming through. And then once you hit that part, it becomes a complicated process because the journal editor makes some decisions about what the next step is at several points. So initially, the editor makes a decision of, should this go out for peer review? Then when it comes, if it goes out for peer review, then the editor gets comments back from the reviewers and has to decide, okay, I'm going to send this to the author. How explicit do I want to be about whether that they're likely to get published or not, and how firm do I want to be in the message that I give the author about what needs to be done in order to make it possible to be published. And oftentimes, usually, the author has to make revisions, and then the editor is making additional decisions of, are these revisions adequate that can just be accepted, or does it need to go through another round of peer review? And this circulating between rounds of peer review can go on for a while. Now, sort of that very first step of even deciding to send out to peer review can be challenging for some people. So sometimes the editors have an easy time of choosing not to send something out for peer review. If they got something that's just spam, or that's totally out of the scope of the journal, or that they can't read or make sense of, they're going to send it back pretty quickly. If they realize that there are huge portions of the document that are plagiarized, oftentimes editors are fairly quick to just say, nope, and send it back. And this is why Hillary is talking with you about that issue of previous publication dissertations, because sometimes it's just that the editor, because they're processing so many articles, isn't really paying attention. Some editors are very much sticklers for all of the details of submission requirements. Others will say, no, it's fine if your citations aren't formatted correctly. This is something that can be handled at the end of the process. Normally, the degree of sticklerness is sort of described in the journal's submission requirements, but there still is variation from one editor to another in two journals that may have otherwise similar looking submission requirements. So I mentioned plagiarism checking. A lot of journals rely on automated software to flag publications that have plagiarized or very similar content in them. What that tends to do is create a situation where the editor can see a document and can look at where the similar content is coming from and how similar the content is through this automated software. Some editors are very good at being thoughtful about whether the similar content is being used appropriately. Others, again, may be rushed and will, if they see a number that's really high in the percent similarity, will be like, nope, even before they've considered whether that might be appropriate for the particular work that is being submitted. So one of the questions that can come up is that there may be situations where you do want to reuse content from previous publications. I'm not talking about dissertations, but I'm talking specifically about perhaps your own published research articles where you are using the same basic method across, say, several different animals, for example, that you initially do some research with fish, then you do a very similar process with mice, and then you do a similar process with rats, that you're looking at something across species. Totally making this up, but just as an example. So you may have a large part of the methods that are similar across all three of these studies that you're doing, and then some details that are specific to each species. When you're in a situation like that, you may want to specifically say these processes are identical. One thing that people will do with that is just say, okay, I'll refer back to the first time it was published, but you're creating a big nuisance for your reader to have to go back to that original article rather than describing the process used. On the other hand, if you describe it in exactly the same way across all three articles, then that, by a lot of the software versions, will treat that as plagiarism. And this has become more and more of a discussion among journal editors, because in the past, they wouldn't even necessarily have realized that this was the exact same content that had been copied and pasted between articles, but now it's sitting there right in front of them from this computerized system. And so we're sort of in a transition stage of figuring out how to handle this. And the text recycling research project has been involved in talking with editors and authors to try to figure out how to handle this, because in the recent past, editors have been very firm of, if it is copied from a previous publication in another journal, that is plagiarism. And they may allow quotations with crediting, but like in the sciences, oftentimes direct quotation isn't the norm. So how do you handle this? And so the text recycling project has created some new guidelines to offer researchers some rules to follow if they're using content from their previously published works. And these guidelines can help you navigate the process of telling the editor, yes, this part of the article is the same as from this previously published article, and addressing sort of how you would cite the previous work and indicate that it's being copied pretty much directly from a previous work. Right now, the text recycling project is just in the process of sort of publicizing what they've done and working with COPE to convince editors that this is a good approach to handling this issue. So editors haven't necessarily fully signed on to this concept, but this is one way of you sort of navigating this process. There's no guarantee that the particular editor that is working for the journal that you're interested in submitting with will be following these guidelines, but at least you have some guidelines to go on that can give you a way of approaching it. And if someone is to question the ethics of what you're doing later, you can basically say, this is how I was approaching this problem, and that I followed all of the requirements that these guidelines set out for me. Then the article will go out for review. Oftentimes this can take a long time because the editors have to find people who are available and qualified to review then those people, once they agree, are usually given like a 3-week window in which to do the review. And oftentimes that can still take a while, that the reviewers don't always meet that window. So what seems like it should be not that long, because the reviewers might only have 3 weeks to review it, can turn into 6 or 12 weeks minimum. And that's assuming a very tight turnaround for the reviewers. Some journals will give reviewers a lot more time, depending on the depth of review that they're expecting, and also depending a little bit on what the reviewers say. Like a reviewer might come back to the editor and say, I'm willing, but I can't even start on this until 3 weeks from now. Can you give me an extension on it? So that's going to take time, and you just sort of need to be prepared for that. And in some cases, you can get information about how long it takes to get a typical review. Again, go to a previous AYR and find out about the CABLS database to get that information. In other cases, you just have to wait and check your email, check your spam folder, make sure you're not missing it when you get the reviewer comments back. So with the reviewer comments, again, this is something where you can find a lot of information on the web about how to handle it. I'm just going to tell you how I handle it, which is to take the reviews and create a checklist. Everything that the reviewers write, compile it into some sort of checklist. And then you have some choices about whether you want to sort of put in order of which things appear in the paper rather than separating out by reviewer. That's my preference, is to put it in order. Some people will go review by reviewer, but breaking out what might be a paragraph of text into individual items to be addressed. And then you can make decisions about how are you going to address these comments. A lot of authors like sometimes run into a problem of, well, this reviewer is asking for something that's ridiculous. And my philosophy in dealing with these comments, and this is just me, is that I try to address everything that I feel comfortable addressing and that I'm able to address. So then when I get down to the handful of things where I think, no, if I did that, that would completely change the meaning of the paper. Or no, if I did that, I would have to spend just as long working on the paper as I spent on it in the past, because they're asking for all of this additional work. I will then just leave those items as the ones where I'm writing my description of what I've done. And that description is where I say, give the, nope, sorry, not going to do that. But in that context of the whole checklist, indicating everything else that I have done to respond to the comments, it becomes clear that I'm not just being obstinate and not just refusing, but that I'm trying to address as much as I can and only skipping the things where I feel like I can't reasonably do those things. Then I'm just trying to create an atmosphere where to the editor and to the reviewers, it looks like I'm working toward improving the paper in the way that they want it to be improved, and that I'm not trying to just stick to exactly how it was written as if that were perfect, because I know it's not perfect. Even after addressing even if I'm able to address all of the reviewers' comments, it's still not going to be a perfect paper. It's just going to be a paper good enough to be published in that journal, hopefully. So that's the next step, is that the editor will make some decisions about the revisions on whether those revisions were enough to meet what is needed to publish in that journal. Sometimes they'll think that there's too much that needed to be changed, that they're not qualified to really make that decision, and they might send it out for a second round of review. And that the way that second round of review goes can vary on whether you're going to get the same reviewers or not, how much the new reviewers will see of the previous reviewers' comments, things like that. And that's so variable, I'm not going to go into the details other than to say that it's variable. And there are a lot of other things about peer review that can be variable, that some journals have blinded peer review, where the reviewers don't know who the authors are and the authors don't know who the reviewers are. Others have open peer review where that information is known. And some also will have blinded peer review, but then post-publication, the review comments get posted on the open web, possibly with the reviewers' names attached to it. And that's what's on this slide is the Publon system. And we'll share the slides after the presentation. I'll be able to look at all of the details of all the variations on how much of that information might get shared out on the open web. So with that, it's back to Hillary for the last few minutes of the presentation, but I will give a minute while we're transitioning. If you have any questions, put them in the chat.
Okay. Okay, so for this last portion, we're going to quickly go over the sort of post-acceptance. There are a couple of things that are just really basic, almost like another round of checklist to make sure that you have, complied with all the requirements. First is actually really important, the review of final proofs. So you'll usually get sent a formatted document where you will be asked to do line-by-line review, line-by-line edits of the article. This is your very last chance to catch errors. Usually you can't make very substantial changes here, usually just spelling errors, grammatical errors, that kind of thing, but it is your very last chance, so very important for a close review. Copyright permissions. If you have been accepted for publication and you needed to get those permissions, you will just be doing a giant round of uploading, probably a bunch of PDFs tied to each one of those tables, figures, whatever you used. And you're going to be getting signatures from each of your co-authors. So you may be responsible for kind of corralling this, or you may just need to make sure that every other author has received, possibly by email, a publishing agreement, and that they have all returned the publishing agreement so that the article can move forward. So kind of the last major thing we're going to talk about is what is in one of these publishing agreements. Generally speaking, like with lots of other contracts or terms and conditions, this publishing agreement is going to outline the rights and the responsibilities that you have and that the publisher has. So one of the key things in these publishing agreements for you to look out for are what kind of rights you have to use and share your article after it's published. So I'll turn back to an example from Sage. They're what they call author archiving and reuse guidelines, which you can find on their website and which outlines what you're going to see in a publishing agreement. So this is really critical here. They have these definitions of 3 different versions of your article. These versions can go by a lot of different names. You'll see here, the first one is original submission, sometimes called a preprint. This is the version of the article that was submitted right from the start before any peer review. The second version is sometimes called an accepted manuscript or postprint. This is the version that's been updated to include all of the revisions based on peer review, but it hasn't yet had any of that sort of final typesetting or layout. So usually like maybe a final Word document you send to the publisher after peer review. The last one is the final published PDF, sometimes called the final version, the publisher version. This one has all the copy editing, the layout, the typesetting. It's that same version that's going to be published on the journal's website. So these 3 are really important because generally speaking, you have rights to use and share your article after publication, but it depends on which 3 of these versions you're using. So here are some sort of common examples. You can share the final published PDF only person to person, for example, with research colleagues, not publicly online. Or you could use portions of it in your thesis or dissertation. Let's say you publish an article based on graduate research, and that publishing happens before you finalize your thesis or dissertation. This is a really important right because you need to be able to fulfill the requirements of your graduate degree and include that information in your thesis or dissertation. Another common right is you can share that second version, that accepted manuscript version, in an institutional repository anytime after the article is accepted, although usually there are some restrictions on this. Sage this is an interesting example. This happens anytime after the article is accepted. It's also really common that you might have to wait to be able to do this, sometimes called an embargo period, maybe 1 or 2 years after publication, before you're allowed to share that accepted manuscript version. And a quick pitch for you, if you do publish any articles while you are at VCU, we have an institutional repository here called Scholars Compass. So this is the kind of platform where in a lot of cases you are going to have the rights to share that accepted manuscript of your journal article. And Scholars Compass is indexed by Google. So right when people are searching online or searching Google Scholar for your research, and let's say they don't have access to a journal through a subscription or, through an institutional access, this is a way that they can still find a free copy of your article online. Okay, and with that, may all your articles be accepted and read and cited. And we are right at time, but we can stick around for just a moment if you have any final questions. And we have been recording this, so we will be getting that recording out to everyone as well. So any final questions? Feel free to type them into the chat if you would like.
I have a question, please. Can you hear me?
I'm not seeing any. Great, so we will be sending out this recording to everyone. We'll have, I guess, email addresses attached to that if you have any questions and you'd like to follow up there as well.
Can you hear me?
Thank you all very much for being here with us, for bearing with us as we had to make some last minute changes based on internet. Oh, I see someone has raised a hand. If you'd like to enter in the chat, or feel free to unmute and ask a question.
I've already unmuted, but I have no idea if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Oh, interesting. I can't hear you, but I can see your question in the live transcript. So I think you can go ahead and ask, and I'll be able to see your question.
Can you hear me now? Is it clear?
No, I'm not sure it's coming through.
Yeah, all we're getting is it clear? I'm not sure it's coming through. Yeah, okay.
Can you hear me now?
Nope, I can't hear you, but strangely I can see it on the transcript, so I'm
Okay.
not sure exactly what's happening.
I have no idea. Now can you hear me? I have no idea. I have changed the headphones and still I have the same
Just go
problem.
ahead and ask your
It's
question.
okay.
The transcript is working fine for us to be able to.
What
Yeah,
I
I
was
think everyone
asking-
else can hear. It must
Okay.
something it's on our end.
Okay, so when I publish a paper and it gets accepted, then I want to apply for like a postdoc position or for a company or anything else. So I'm not allowed to share my final PDF version of the publication unless I take the permission from the journal, or is it okay as it's my publication?
Okay, good question. So I rushed through that last part a little bit. So one major decision point on that is whether it's an open access journal or whether it's a subscription access journal. So if it's an open access journal, it will be free to read, free to access. You will have full rights to share it with whoever you want in whatever way you want. There are more and more open access journals that charge fees for publishing, and that's not always something that is very accessible for graduate students. We do have some agreements with publishers, we and the Virginia Academic Library Consortium, that cover those fees. So I can make sure, I think I can send out a link with some of that information when we send the recording out. Beyond that, it really depends on the exact terms of your publishing agreement. I mentioned it is very common now that you can share that accepted manuscript version, even publicly online, for example, usually in a non-commercial repository like Scholars Compass. You may have to wait a year or two to do that, so that isn't always the best automatic way to share. You can usually share that final PDF with research collaborators. So let's say you're in a postdoc position or you're, like you said, working in another company or something. If you're working with collaborators in your future job, your future position, you may be able to share that article directly with them, so long as you are not sharing it publicly online. So it kind of depends on what exact needs you have for sharing. If you have a specific article publication already in mind, you can get in touch with me and I'm happy to look over the policy or the publishing agreement and figure out exactly what you're permitted to do with the article.
Yeah, and oftentimes the policies will explicitly talk about situations like sharing on sort of a locked down system, a staff intranet for your employer where it's not available to people beyond your employer. But the terms of whether that's allowed or not are going to depend on the particular publication agreement.
Great. Thank you very much.
Right. Any other questions? If anybody wanted to unmute or add in the chat quickly. Okay, great. Well, thank you all again so much for being here. Recording will be on its way. I've got some ideas for some additional links that I mentioned that we can add in there as well. So thanks so much, and we will hopefully see you for a future Advance Your Research.
Yeah, so we'll have the slides up within the next couple of days and then the recording up within the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, everyone.